Welcome to One More Things, a podcast about art, culture, and ideas. Wherever you are, whenever you are listening, thank you for tuning in. As someone who is over 17 years clean and sober, I'm always on the lookout for how addiction and recovery are portrayed in art and pop culture. I'm interested in representation. How are these stories depicted in books or movies? What is it like to see bits and pieces of myself reflected back through text and images? When I came across Nick Gardner's collection of linked stories, Delinquents, and Other Escape Attempts, I thought this was as good a portrait of addiction and recovery as I have read. This book, and the stories within, looks at this topic through clear eyes, but more than that, it has heart and humor. Gardner loves these characters, flaws and all, and has no use for dwelling only on the fuel of darkness. Nick joined me for a conversation about delinquents, recovery, writing, and other things. It was a generous and stimulating chat, and I hope you enjoyed the show today. Nick Gardner, thank you for joining me today. And I want to say, first off, I really dug this book. And not only for the use of language and voice, and especially character voice, but I felt a lot of personal connection to this book because of my own background. But, I mean, we'll get to that later. In a lot of ways, I am kind of the ideal reader for this book, too. But I'd like to start, if we could, with the structure of the book. So the question of why linked stories. I think a lot about how form and content play together. And so, yeah, I guess I'm curious why this form for this content.
Yeah, for sure. So part of it, originally, it was kind of, I kind of figured out that they were linked as I wrote the book. But I love the idea that I might be in conversation a little bit with Winesburg, Ohio, Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio.
Right.
But I also know that there are a lot of other authors who have written their own Winesburg, Ohio. So I didn't want to like step on any toes or redo the same thing over and over again that other people have done. But for me, it was just like a discovery kind of that they were linked. I found out that like there was a bartender in one scene, and I realized, oh, this is like Dunk, who appears in this other scene. So the characters kept on popping up. And then I think actually Place was maybe the secondary link that I found. So I think, I mean, I feel like they're now linked with People is one link, Place, and then maybe language, and then the discussion of addiction and these escape attempts kind of thing.
Yeah, since you brought up Place and Winesburg, Ohio, I first want to ask the question, have you read any Donald Ray Pollock?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So you're familiar with Knock 'em Stiff, which to me was really kind of a interesting companion book to this.
Yeah.
I mean, along with obviously Winesburg, Ohio, but of course being set in Ohio, I think those are the two titles that really came to mind, and especially with the kind of, addiction recovery escape attempts and how that really aligns with Don's work as well. So since you brought up Place, let's talk about Ohio in the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest originally. I grew up in Indiana, in Indianapolis, and then went to Columbus and went to Ohio State for my undergrad and graduate work.
Okay.
So I studied a little bit with Lee K. Abbott, and Abbott would always talk about the importance of setting, and he would say something along the lines of, this story can only happen in this place. And so I was curious of how then that location, or how choosing the setting of Ohio, right, played into that as well.
Yeah. I love Don Pollock. I missed him the two times he read in my small hometown. I missed him. And I wrote him a letter once and he never responded, but I'm not angry about that. I'm sure he did a lot. But yeah, and Lee K. Abbott too. One of my good friends, Bill Pancoast, who's also a writer, has self-published a few books, but he studied under Lee Abbott too. And passed down some wisdom to me. So yeah, Lee's kind of a legend, but I don't know that
Right.
many people outside Ohio know him. Yeah,
He's weirdly like not read as much as he should be, and being held in such a high regard.
yeah,
I mean, I guess he's what would I guess if we have to be cliche and call him like a writer's writer, right?
yeah, yeah,
Right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, outside of like academia and outside of I guess like these kind of circles, yeah, not enough people know about him.
yeah. But yeah, I guess getting back to the question of like
Sorry.
writing about Ohio as the place, like um, I guess my experience growing up in Ohio was like house shows and like um, we didn't go to art galleries because there weren't any in my small town. There are plenty in Columbus and Cleveland,
Right.
but so people would set up a show at their house. So kind of just this idea of like we all are wanting the same things. Like artistically, we all want the same things. We just don't have access, but we're gonna make it happen anyways. So I think that was a lot of that's what I think of when I think about like Mansfield, Ohio, where I grew up
Right.
as a place. But I'm sure, well, I've seen that in a lot of other small towns as well. Hanif Abdurraqib does a lot of writing about like his experiences in Ohio, and I think they reflect a lot of my own too. Um, yeah, just like finding art wherever you're at,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah, and that I mean that is something that is I think prevalent throughout this book as well is that kind of search for artistic escape as well as all these other types of escapes, whether it's through drugs and alcohol or whether it's just getting out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, so, yeah, something about the characters then. These stories are largely about characters who struggle with addiction, aimlessness, and identity. But there's a sense of humor. I feel like in a lot of these, there's a lightness to them, right? And this is where it really varies from or differentiates from like a Donald Ray Pollock story that is kind of so dark and
yeah,
gritty. Do you? I'll put it this way: you seem to have a lot of love for these characters.
yeah, definitely.
And I think the title too, right? Delinquents. It's not. It's almost like I mean, you think delinquents, you think juvenile delinquents, right? You think of small time offenders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that a conscious decision? Was it something that just kind of organically grew?
Yeah. So like, I mean, part of the thing I knew like whose shadow I was writing in, right? Like Sherwood
Yeah.
Anderson and Pollock, and what's his name? The guy that wrote the book, Stephen Markley's book,
Okay.
Ohio. And those are all like such dark stories. And for one thing, being an addict myself previously, like I the one thing I wanted to think about a lot was that when I was an addict, like there were a lot of good times, and at a certain point, like the bad times outweighed the good. But I still had a sense of humor. I still had connections with people. Um, you can still do things that normal people do when you're using drugs, but after a while, it gets hampered by the drug use
Right.
quite a bit. So I wanted to like I didn't want to just get lost in darkness on this trip. I wanted some kind of levity. Um, Another thing was actually when a couple of people have mentioned like Sam Lipsyte in regards to my writing, and like I was reading a lot of Sam Lipsyte when I was writing a lot of these stories, so I think some of that trickled in because he's hilarious,
Yeah.
and just like the wordplay too is fun. So um, I guess a lot of it just like I was like writing myself into a good mood half the time, like um, and remembering like the funny stories, right? Like the funny stories from my past. Like there are, well, I guess one thing that I think about with addiction is like I lived like the exciting part of my life already, and I can like sit down and reminisce. and think about the good times. So I think there was a lot of that going into this as well.
So you also wrote an essay titled "How a Writer Should Be," right? And you talk about these. You specifically mentioned James Fry's memoirs,
Yeah.
and you talk about this kind of eschewing just writing about the dark times, right? And so it's refreshing in that way. It's also, look, I am 17 years in recovery. I'll share that with you on here as well. So I know exactly what you mean when you talk about like having the exciting times and having these like stories. I mean, I still like dine out on stories from when I was drinking, right? And they're
Yeah.
just hilarious. And of course they grow in legend, right? As I as I
Yeah.
tell them.
Sure.
Um, I, I I was surprised to learn in that essay that you still drink, and there's no judgment there. Just I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something. It's weird because I've done two of my book release events at breweries,
Yeah.
and I feel like I have to like tell everyone before, like I'm okay. I'm not like falling off the wagon or anything. Um, but yeah, drinking was a problem for me before because I was just like a dumpster. Like I just took everything. I think that's the AA term, right? Like I just took everything
Yeah.
I could take.
Hmm.
um, but now, like, one thing that helped me actually was like weirdly, the craft beer industry. And then I worked at a winery, like 4 years after I was in recovery. So I did go, I believe, 4 years without touching anything at all. And actually, when I got into like craft beer and wine, I quit. That was when I quit smoking,
Mm.
um, and I got a lot of it, like enjoyment of like the process, like how to make it. Um, so that's one thing I always think about with like beer and wine is like I love the process. I love how the product, like how the beer becomes this beer, and I enjoy drinking it. But what's weird is actually I don't enjoy being drunk as much as I used to. And I kind of discovered that maybe it was maybe irresponsible of me to like to explore that again, but yeah, in my sobriety, like I kind of discovered craft beer and wine, and I met a few other people who were really big in the brewing scene. One person who doesn't drink at all, but
Mm.
still brews beer, but a few people that do enjoy beer. But right now, I'm transitioning into ownership of this beer and wine store where I work, and I have all these reps that come in at 11 a.m. and they're like, try this wine," and I a lot of times find myself like spitting it out, like tasting and then spitting it because I'm like, I really do not want to feel buzzed right now,
Right.
and that makes me feel like pretty comfortable. That's one example of like how I feel pretty comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
congratulations on the ownership, on
yeah,
the new role. That's great.
yeah,
But I think, I mean, what you're saying just goes to show that there is no kind of one size fits all recovery, right?
right,
That, I mean, AA would tell you, and look, I don't want to like talk shit about AA, right? I
yeah,
think it's worked for a lot of people. It didn't work for me, and it sounds like you took a different path as well. Um,
yeah,
but I think the AA speak would tell you that you're doing it wrong, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and so it's kind of a harm reduction model, and I will say honestly to you that I'm a bit jealous
yeah,
of you that you're able to do that, because I was very similar, where it was, drinking was the main thing, but as soon as you put anything in front of me, I'm like, yeah, I'll try it. Yeah, sure. And I had to try everything at least twice, right? Just to make sure.
yeah,
This also, this idea about how there's no, one sense of recovery or just a, one kind of addict, I think also plays a big part in the book as well. I mean, something that I was taken with in this book is how diverse the characters are, in that we have main characters who are, I would say, young men in their 20s, two brothers in their 60s, couples, queer characters, right? I think, wait, was it just one sort of lead female character in one of the stories,
yes,
Lisa? Okay, but still, right? But I think that you were able to capture the voice of each of these characters, which I found really pleasantly surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I commend you on that. And I think it shows.
Yeah,
I think it should.
Rehab a lot to thank for that. Just where I got to know a lot of different people very personally, and people from such different backgrounds. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where you can like meet that many diverse people for an extended period of time.
Yeah, it's a kind of great leveler, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even going in and out of the rooms of AA or any kind of when I was at Ohio State, I went to a support group on campus, and it was for anybody and everybody. I mean, you contacted the guy who was running it, and he was like, yes, right, you would be a great fit for us. And so you come in and you sit in this room with people who were still in active addiction, or were curious, or like trying to figure stuff out. And then you had people like me who were years sober at that time. But it was such an experience, right, of meeting different people and hearing different stories. I mean, it's a great, I think, tool for creating empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And understanding. And then, of course, like using it to, write fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, like I said, in a very kind of, all authentic way. This brings me to also this idea of kind of the self-aware addict. That character in Orange Pill, Yellow Wrangler, Yellow Jeep, where he knows who he is and what he is, but still dreams of something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, that one was one of the harder stories emotionally. Actually, I published another version that was kind of like straightforward prose. That was like one of my first published pieces years ago. And then it still didn't feel quite right. So the current version is kind of, it's almost written in meter. It was at one point written in meter. Yeah, anyways, it was hard because it was very personal, and because I think that was the point where I realized like I need to get better. When I was an addict, was that I realized like I actually do want more than this, and I'm never gonna like. I was like, before I could like play it off like I wanted to become a writer while I was getting high, and I was like, I can still do this. Like Hunter Thompson did it, this guy did it, like. And then there was a point where I was like, shit, no, this is all it is for me. Like, if I don't do something, and then it took rehab and many months to finally get to the place where I could focus on other things, but and focus on my writing. But I would say that's still like what keeps me sober, is because I love to write. I like the writing communities that I'm surrounded by, and like I know I would lose all of that if I got back into drugs, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean that was it. That was one of the things that we would always talk about. It was these things that were kind of the internal consequences much more than the external consequences. Those are the things that kind of keep us on track, right, or keep us from slipping. And it's not so much, going back to jail or going to rehab, but it's the stuff that we lose that make us really part of us.
Exactly. Yeah. Even drinking. I mean, I'm like, if I have a full beer, I know I'm not going to be writing after that, or I'm going to look at what I wrote the next day and be like, you shouldn't have had that beer before you wrote. Right. So when I'm like really crunched for time, I'm like, okay, I don't have time to drink right now. I need to focus on writing or reading a book.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I read a little bit from the opening of Drug Magic? Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Now that Abe no longer shoots heroin, he sounds like a $50 self-help seminar. And the problem is, I've seen this all before. The problem is that my life these days is a series of dips and dives while my brother, despite his past, keeps thriving. The problem is he won't shut up about it. So I love this opening on one hand because it sort of depicts one of the maybe tropes or misconception of addicts in recovery, and that some of them become a kind of, I don't know, traveling preacher for recovery, right? These kind of guys who go out and just proselytize.
Yeah, yeah. I had a counselor somewhat recently, a couple years ago, who was like that. Like he was like, "Oh, you can't drink. You need to start going to meetings." And I'm like, "Dude, I'm sorry. We're gonna have to split ways. Like, you're more obnoxious than my mom was when I was using." Like, yeah, that story was partly I wrote it partly for my sister actually, who um, she actually wrote me a letter when I was in rehab, and and that was my second time, and she was basically like, stop being an asshole. Like, even when you were sober for a few months, you were an asshole. Like, stop doing it. And um, and that's I think that partly woke me up. But I have seen like some of the AA groups I've been in were um, I don't know if I'd say predatory, but they were like I had people like calling me at all hours and like finding out where I lived and stopping by to make sure I was okay when I hadn't been there. And um, so I think yeah, becoming sober doesn't make you a good person.
No.
You have to be a good person too. Like,
Yeah, and again, I mean, this idea that this one method works for everyone is just it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's not reality. We're all, I know this sounds cliche, but like we're all individuals and different and unique, and so we're going to take these different paths to get, clean or get sober.
yeah,
Yeah. No, it is the recovery community can be, yeah, annoying, and I think predatory is the right word. And I've been in some of those groups where, some of the things people say, I'm like, well, that's the last time I'm coming back to this meeting. I can't I can't listen to sort of secondhand abuse. You know, you taught in higher ed for a while. Is that correct?
just mostly just through my MFA at Bowling Green, and
Okay.
then a little bit more than that. But yeah,
So I guess I'm curious in some ways how or if I guess your journey to recovery has that played a part in your professional life in terms of I guess like the brewery ownership or teaching in the classroom.
yeah. No, I mean, I think for one thing, it definitely taught me empathy, for sure. Um, well, to be honest, I had trouble teaching in higher ed because I feel like I tried to be people's friends way more than
Mm.
I should have. And just because I would read a story by someone and be like genuinely excited about it, and I wanted to like keep my passion, but I think I let it kind of like go over like me just being a little bit as aloof as I needed to be. But yeah, it definitely helped. And I did, I taught during the pandemic, like during, like right at the beginning of the pandemic. So there were a few students that like I feel like I wouldn't have done this as well if I had been through my own thing. But there were a couple of students that I was pretty sure were using drugs, but they were also like having trouble with like making car payments. So the one guy had lost his car, another guy got in a wreck and like lost his cat in the same day and was losing his apartment. And I was able to, I think, like level with them and like um, when I went to rehab, I actually worked there for like a year afterwards. So I think that was when I kind of learned to be like stern with people like myself. Like if someone hadn't been stern with me and made me go to rehab in the first place, I wouldn't have gone. So yeah, I think it did definitely influence that, like how I treated them, because I knew that I would have loved to be treated with like all the kindness in the world and given all the extensions on my project in the world, but that wouldn't have actually done anything for me in the long run. So
Yeah, it's a fine line, isn't it?
yeah,
It's a fine line of knowing how generous to be, but then knowing how much is too much at that point, and how much you are, harming yourself while you're doing that as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
Same with the beer and wine store. Actually, like I do have quite a few customers who are. Um, I mean, I don't want to be the one who determines if someone's an alcoholic or not, but who are drinking from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and coming in multiple times. And um, I part of it is just learning my job. Like I can't take it too far, but at the same time, I can be like, hey, let's shoot for just like drinking 2 bottles of wine today instead of 4. Like let's pace this out. So I do have actually a customer that um, we have a limit. We set a limit in the morning when she comes in, and she drinks that much. I don't know if she drinks somewhere else too. That's not my problem, but like, yeah, just
right.
trying something and trying to be friends too. Like, be kind at the same time and not chase her off. But yeah,
Yeah, and it goes back to that idea of, I mean, a lot of times I, I still know people who drink, and I have friends who will drink around me, and they will say something like, "Oh, I'm sorry, is this okay?" Or or they'll say like, "Well, I'm only gonna have one," and I'm like, I'm not that kind of alcoholic, man. I'm not here to tell you what you should do.
yeah.
Another how, and feel free not, I guess, to answer this, but how open are you with people about any struggles or any past struggles?
Oh, I'm pretty open about it.
Okay.
Like I think Kevin Breen, my editor or my publisher too, had asked me if it was okay to mention that in my bio and stuff. And I actually have been doing it for like anytime I get something published, I mention my history. I mentioned that I think I usually just say that I'm a recovered addict. Like I don't like the idea of being in recovery because I feel like I've, especially now, I feel like I'm not really interested at all. And like heroin was my main thing, so I have no interest in doing heroin again
Right.
um, for many years actually now. And but I think, well, for one thing, it does. It can be like a PR thing, right? Like I feel like I hate to say it, but I feel like it makes me interesting, and I mean, I feel like that's true. Like we talked about James Frey, like his Million Little Pieces, like all that was just an interesting book because he was an addict. Like I don't know that it was the best written book or anything, but people would jump right on that because he's an addict. So part of it was that kind of thing. Part of it is like it does like um, it makes conversations easier. Honestly, it's like once that's out of the way, it's going to be awkward for like the first time I bring it up. It's always awkward.
Usually for them, though, it's more
Yeah,
awkward for
yeah,
them, right?
yeah. And then the other thing that I don't know if I use mentioned this in my story collection, but like I have in other stories, like the when you see an obituary and it's like this guy was 38 and he died quietly, and you're like, oh, he probably overdosed, and and there was a big thing like during the opioid epidemic in Ohio where there's a movement where parents were actually saying like in the obituary this person overdosed. So I think giving a voice to that is a big deal. And then I mean, I think I when people see me, they're just like, oh, this is just a average white dude. Like, so to bring that up and be like, oh yeah, you can come from this crazy past and then like, you know, be, I don't know, I don't think I'm quite middle class yet, but be a nice person and be, yeah, just a regular guy. And
it it destigmatizes it, right?
yeah,
In a way, yeah. And I find the same thing with myself. I'm pretty open. I don't walk into a room and announce it, right? I don't walk in and just go, "Hello, I'm Brock. I'm an alcoholic," and everyone responds back, "Hi, Brock. And just glad to be here. Just happy to be here." But
yeah,
it more often than not will come up, and I also find that it's a way to protect myself. I mean, I have had too many people, say, "Hey, let's go out and get a beer," and I'm like, no, I'll have a club soda with you, but I'm not gonna have a beer. And then they're like, oh, okay. And so it sort of immediately, yeah, disarms that conversation, so we don't have to have it anymore. But it also, yeah, I find that it protects myself. But
Yeah,
I am, as I'm sure you probably are too. I am wary about wearing that as an identity.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I don't know, especially like that was a big problem for me with AA. I never wanted to go in and say I'm an alcoholic every day or I'm an addict. And part of that, I think, is yeah, part of it is because it is stigma when you do that. And I feel like saying, I don't know, that's why I've always gone with the term like I'm a recovered addict, or that it's something like in the past. Um, and I guess this is a little bit tangential, but like the idea of the coins always bothered me with AA because I was like, um, well, so honestly, after I got out of rehab, I tried cocaine a couple times. I tried, I found a bag of pills lying on the ground once, and I took them, like opioids, and I took them, and both of those experiences were like pretty miserable for me. Um, so it just like reinforced that like, oh yeah, I don't really want this anymore. Um, but I feel like if I was in AA or NA, that would have been like I would have had to turn in my coin, get a new one. But for me, it felt like progress more than a failure when I did that. So
Well, and there's the old saying too that relapse is part of recovery, right?
yeah, yeah,
And again, like I don't want to, I don't need to put a title on what relapse is or what recovery is either, right?
yeah,
But I
yeah,
mean that's what that sounds like to me. Is that you're like, okay, I did this, and I'm evolving, right? I'm progressing. I am moving forward now.
yeah.
Okay, so I know we've mentioned your bio a couple of times, and I want to bring up. I need to find the quote exactly because this is really interesting to me. You write in your bio that you're looking at drug and alcohol treatment through the lenses of critical theory and intersectionality. So could you talk a little bit about what that means to you?
Yeah. Well, so I haven't been doing as much studying as I used to about addiction, but I was reading a lot about like women's experience in recovery because that's very different. And like trans people's experience in recovery is
Mm-hmm.
very different from mine. So I will. So the weird thing about my rehab that I went to was it was actually run by the Church of Scientology, um, and there are quite a few of them around. They don't the Narcanon program. They don't actually say they are part of the
Okay.
Church of Scientology, but um, when I stayed on to work, there was like a kind of a push to join. Well, there not kind of. There was a big push to join
I
the
was
church.
I was gonna say, I mean, not to talk poorly about any religion, but yeah, kind of a push probably. I was
Yeah,
gonna say,
yeah.
it was probably a gentle shove, right?
It was maybe not even gentle shove, but, and it was one of those things where like, yeah, I guess like just any kind of cult, like you don't realize what how far you've, or even with addiction, like you don't realize how far into it you've gotten until you look back really and you're like, oh shit, I never would have done any of this if I was thinking clearly. Um, but the reason I bring that up is because like Scientology and a lot of religions like are well, they don't treat women well, um, and they don't treat like uh, homosexuals well. Like Scientology definitely doesn't. Um, so yeah, there's it's one thing for me to go in there, go be an addict and like go through rehab. It's another totally different thing for especially a woman. Like if you've read like accounts of women who have made it to rehab, I think in AA there was even something, and maybe it's not in the big book, but it's just something that is talked about in the rooms that um, a woman has to go through so much more to get to the point where they go to rehab, to get to the point where they're broke and they can't afford drugs. And there's a lot of like sexual abuse for women, especially who are drug addicts. So yeah, I studied. I took a class on folklore, and that was one of the most interesting things. Was actually researching folklore on addiction and um, just listening to people's stories. And there is the story Spitbacks in
Mhm.
my book. I kind of dug into that because like one of the things that I brought up was like people in this story, this guy's interviewing other people, and in a lot of their accounts, they talked about like their bone density, uh, like losing bone density because of using opioids, and that's a total myth. But like I always believed that there's a whole like with a needle, like if there's an air bubble in it, you're gonna die immediately, and it's like no,
Yeah.
it's not.
And
It's
so
not.
the flicking of the needle, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there are all these actions that you do with drugs, with alcohol, like with cigarettes, even like the way you hold a cigarette. So yeah, I was really interested in that. Like, why are we doing things this way? Like, what's the truth behind it? But why do we, as a culture, like, why are we following this direct path?
Yeah, and I mean that kind of sounds like Roland Barthes' mythologies as well, right? I mean that
Yeah,
kind of his writing on wine, in the French culture, versus other cultures, right? And how did we come to think of it this way? And where do these stories come from that now they're all believed by everyone? They become so ingrained that they are truth, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting idea on how recovery affects, people from different, ethnic backgrounds as well. But also, I think, I mean, the idea of addiction too, right? And how we look at. I mean, you just said, people see me as kind of an average white guy and don't believe or are surprised that I came from this background,
yeah,
right? And but we have a different sort of attitude or perception of someone else.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure where else to go with that. But that's so. Let me ask this question: so, do you think that fiction is the best way to talk about these stories?
Oh, for me, definitely.
Okay.
Part of it is I can be wrong and not get in any trouble. I think that's the biggest thing is like I can be wrong. Another thing that so my dad tells I actually hadn't seen my dad or really talked to him like had a big conversation with him in a while. Like we get along fine. It just been a while, but growing up and even now, he kind of tells the same story like that. You know that movie Big Fish.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a lot like that. Like he has these like tall stories. So I growing up, I always I think it was actually in high school when I first got called out for like
Mm.
making up stories, and my friends were like, "Dude, why are you lying?" And I was like, "Oh, I thought that's just how we told stories. It was like we made things bigger. Like if I went on a drive for 200 miles, I really went on a drive for 300 miles. Like
Right.
that's what it felt like. So I think that's why I like using fiction rather than nonfiction in this setting. Um, well, I guess there are many reasons. One reason is I have a little bit of distance. Um, Another reason is I can like cobble together my story and other people's stories and make it a more interesting story, I think, than my personal story. But another thing is I can like tell the story how it feels rather than by the fact, like the way it actually happened. Because I did have like a couple mild overdoses, which I recovered from just fine, but my characters have had way more severe overdoses, and I only know about those through my friends' experiences. But mine felt bad enough that, like, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, most of the essays that I've written and published, and I know this isn't about me, but I'm just sharing, right?
yeah,
um,
no,
have 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 been about, you know, addiction, recovery, depression, death, that kind of idea. And I found myself writing a lot about other people that I was there with, right? Kind of watching, you know, as an observer. And I never felt, and I think this is something that, you know, we talked about a lot at Ohio State was, are you sort of betraying your own idea of truth? And, you know, if this other person were to read this, how would they quibble, or would they quibble? Right? And I think we all have that line, but I think you're right. It's much less strict with fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would like to do more nonfiction. I mean, I have a couple essays that are out for record and review, but I think part of it is I'm still not ready yet to. I mean, even well, now it's almost 11 years, and I still don't feel like I can totally write about what happened. I forgot a lot of it. I mean, a lot of it I was in kind of a foggy state. So,
right. I mean, that is something I think. That anybody writing about this stuff struggles with, right? Because we weren't in our quote unquote right mind. we were going about this. So how do you look back and go, oh, I remember exactly, right, when I was blackout drunk? It's like, no, you don't. No. But will the reader, or will someone forgive us that, right, as they understand? I guess we hope so.
That would be an interesting challenge, like try to write a blackout. How do you write a blackout?
Yeah, I mean, you just say, I blacked out, and then I guess you kind of move on to another scene, right? Yeah. I don't know what else to do. Yeah. This brings me to the novella that you've included in Delinquents, Captain Failure, where Dunk, a minor character from another story, kind of takes center stage, and he's struggling to stay sober, struggling to reintegrate himself into society, and everyone he knows is connected to booze or drugs in some way, right? And there's a line there, and it goes, he needed to lay off the shit to survive, but was survival worth it if you were all alone? And I feel like this is such an accurate thought, right? That all of us kind of in this position have thought before. And it's one, I think, rendered so clearly. I mean, I remember having to relearn how to do so many things without booze, right? And without holding a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Is this a sentiment that people don't get or don't realize? And not just non-alcoholics and non-addicts, but the addicts and alcoholics as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think it would be so much harder, especially giving up alcohol, like, because as you mentioned before, like people will invite you out for a drink, and that's like, I do have a couple of friends that have stopped drinking, and I even met somebody recently who had quit drinking, but I didn't know that he had quit drinking. So I was like, well, do you want to meet at this brewery? And he's like, well, no, probably not. So I think that's much harder, just because it's so socially acceptable. But yeah, I don't know that. I remember, like, I was super lonely when I first got out of rehab. I didn't have any friends. I had moved back to my hometown, so the friends I did have, I was trying to avoid, and then making new friends, you kind of have just like the AA rooms, or like, where do you go? Especially when you're, I don't know, it's hard enough making friends like in your late 20s, early 30s. Like, how do you make friends after that? So I think it can be super lonely.
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, so I grew up in Indianapolis, which is not, I mean, it's probably, a million-ish people, somewhere around there. But there was, we all grew up on kind of the east side of town, Catholic side of town. It was blue collar-ish, right? Most people, electricians, school teachers, that kind of work. And I'm amazed at how many people are still there that I know. And when I go back home to see family, how many people I do not want to see, right?
Oh yeah.
Because of that past. But it reminded me. I mean, that was another thing as I was reading this book. I was thinking about how, from an early age, I wanted to get out of there somehow, or get out of. And then as I got older, I wanted to get out of that bubble. Um,
Yeah.
that so I was rereading the novella this morning, and Dunk feels like a kind of complete portrait of the life of someone in recovery. Um, it has that feeling of someone sort of teetering on the edge the whole time, but never falling. That I think is like there in real life. I was
Yeah.
worried for Dunk like the entire time, but Dunk really wants to sort of push back against that perceived identity.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So like, so he befriends Mara, who's using a lot of drugs. And for one thing, I thought I wanted to have, yeah, I wanted to. It was weird because in that essay that I wrote about like the fuel of darkness, and which is that's not my term, that's someone else's. Shoot, now I can't think of
I
Leslie
can't.
Jameson.
Yes, right,
Yeah.
right. It
Um,
was it was in her essay from the New Yorker, or was it the New York Times?
I believe it was a New Yorker. Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
it was a great essay.
yeah,
But I didn't want to. I feel like it's almost like it's kind of cheating, right? To like, if you have someone in recovery and you have drugs around them, it's like you got the tension there already. You
yeah.
almost don't even need to write the story because like the reader's gonna be waiting to see if they fuck up or not. Um, but I was adamant from the beginning that Dunk was not going to, and I think by the time I started writing that, really I started writing that after I had already like conceived of who Dunk was, and I kind of did a character sketch and like um, I was like I need to write a story about him. Like I knew this guy so well, so I was sure that he was going to be someone who actually would be able to like maintain his sobriety too. Um, so I guess yeah, I went into it knowing that he was going to be okay and was going to get through this, and was going to be tempted. Like there's the scene in the beginning where he like someone passes him a joint and he realizes it, and I wanted to like hit on those little things, like those little actions that like you don't think about. It's part of the yeah. You just if someone hands you a beer, like you take it and then you realize, oh shit, I don't want this now. Um, so yeah, I definitely wanted him to go through that, but I also knew that he wasn't going to succumb to it at all. Also, Mara, maybe this is a spoiler alert, but like I always type thing, but like I never wanted her to be an addict. Like, um, and I still don't think she is. I think she got out and she's fine. Um, and that was one thing I thought of with a lot of the stories in this too. Like, there are like I know a lot of people who've taken a lot of drugs and then just stopped and are fine and upstanding citizens and whatever. So I did want to have people like that in there too, like the people that like where whether you say it's in our DNA that we're addicts or whatever the science is. I don't know the science. I don't know that anyone really has an answer for it, but like, yeah, I just wanted to like show that there are these people that can like that have it easy almost in my eyes, right? But I'm sure they have other problems to deal with too.
Yeah, I never felt so. Even though like I was worried for Dunk the entire time, I never thought he was going to drink or use. But it just felt like so real, and I mean it's one of those things that you. So again, right, being in recovery or whatever, being clean and sober for
Yeah.
so long, it it I don't know that it's necessarily gotten easier. I'm just more aware of where my kind of like limit is on things. Where I can go out to a bar with a group of people, but I know at a certain point I'm going to get up and disappear. Like you won't, I'm just going to leave because the smell of gin is going to get to me at a certain point, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like that's exactly how I felt with Dunk is that this guy knew like, okay, I need to sort of I know my limits. I know kind of, where to go and when to leave. And the same thing with Mara. I didn't feel like she was an addict. I felt like she was a young woman who was, partying, having fun, and she never gave off that. You didn't write her in a way to where I was like, oh, she's going to overdose or get into something deeper, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, yes, I think that we have to imagine her as getting out and moving on, right? And succeeding in that way.
Yeah.
This novella also brings up the idea of trauma and past trauma and how that aids addiction, how that kind of feeds addiction. Because, I mean, again, as we both know from being in those rooms, what you hear is our problem isn't drugs and alcohol, right? It's the thing that we were trying to use drugs and alcohol to like forget or keep down or not deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely. So, I mean, I wasn't raised in the same situation as Dunk, but I was raised like in very Christian home, very limited. Like I wasn't allowed to listen to any kind of secular music. Uh, Fortunately, during my younger years, it was like the Christian music scene, if you'll call it that, was had some good musicians. But at the same time, like I felt like I was so sheltered. And then when I found drugs and alcohol, I found them like I was like, this isn't what was described to me. Like I thought heroin was this horrible, dangerous thing, but like I can snort it and it's fine, and I just feel good for a little bit, and then the next day I feel fine again. Um, until you don't, but and same with alcohol, really too. Like it wasn't this evil thing that I thought it was. So I think that's something that definitely plays into it, right? Like into Dunk's past, like it was a good solution, and like alcohol, like partying in my teens with friends, like after high school or during high school, really, and after, um, was like a good release for me, I think, and I did. So I think that kind of gets back to the whole like there are good parts of addiction and there are bad parts of it, and it does open up certain doors for you, but it overall, like, I mean, can really like cripple you for years to come. So yeah.
Yeah, and I often, will tell people that like, yeah, there's probably a lot that I wish I didn't do, right, or wouldn't have done,
Yeah.
because of drugs and alcohol, but also going through so much of that, I feel like has made me into, who I am today, like me or not, right?
Yeah.
I do think that the novella Captain Failure, and I'm really glad that was included, really kind of brings everything together. All the other stories and all of the other, attributes that each story has. This one feels like it really kind of distills, no pun intended, distills everything down that you're trying to get at.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was yeah, that story took much more work and editing than everything else. And honestly, when I finally got my galley in hand and I was reading through it, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I wanted it to be. Like I definitely intended it to pull a lot of things together, but it didn't. It wasn't until way later where those things started to be pulled together.
I'm curious about the decision not to put it last in the book.
Oh yeah, I had a so one of my professors, Lawrence Coates, when I was talking to him about the layout of the book, and he had mentioned having we talked a lot about where a novella goes, because
Mm-hmm.
there are a couple of books where it goes in the beginning. Usually, it's the last story. Um, but we talked about how both of our experiences, where sometimes when the novella is the last story, you're like, usually the middle of a story collection is like it loses some energy, and then you get to this long piece where like maybe for me a lot of times I don't look ahead to see how long it is. So like I'll be reading a collection and I'm reading thinking I have two more stories left, but it's actually a novella. So say I have like 30 minutes in the morning to read, I'm like reading it and then I'm like, oh man, this is taking forever. um, and then he mentioned having a story at the end, and he compared it to a grace note, like this little, like kind of half note at the end
Mm-hmm.
that kind of changes, not theme, but like changes the energy or the flow of the piece. And that story, Drug Magic, that I end on, it was actually the first story I wrote before I even conceived of the collection. And I feel like Captain Failure is pretty hopeful, but that story is maybe one of the most hopeful. Um, and then the last line of it, I thought would be like the perfect way to end a book. So yeah,
I would say that like Drug Magic really does, for as short as it might be, kind of takes us on a roller coaster, doesn't it?
yeah,
um, which which I really like. And so here's the, I mean, the last the last line of that story, Drug Magic. Right. Well, it starts with, "We'll go sweep up the rust, mow the yard, plant a damn garden. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We need to, and we'll use that need like a drug." That really is a great way to close out this collection.
yeah.
Yeah.
It ends on drug. That's yeah,
Right, but it also sort of makes note of how we're addicted to things that aren't just drugs, right?
yeah,
That, at this point or in this story, the kind of idea of hope or like looking forward is as much of a drug as anything else.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Do you okay, speaking of that, sorry, this is just kind of a random thought, but do you did you feel that way in terms of learning about the craft of beer and wine?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it. I mean, I read a lot about beer and wine too, and I would say I put a lot of the same effort. Actually, being a beer and wine buyer has been um, really interesting because I would compare it a lot to like buying drugs. It, it's not it's not as illegal, but you do have to kind of like find the right people who have what you want. Um, Sometimes it involves not necessarily like shady dealings, but it involves like some weird, some weird brewer in Germany has to be able to like package up their beer. There are a lot of laws that people get around to, like if they can't import a certain beer, like they'll import a keg and then can the beer in the United States. But yeah, I'm already getting into it, like where I really
Right.
enjoy the process of trying to like find something that's hard to get and obtaining it and then enjoying it.
Yeah, right, and not getting in trouble while you're doing it.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess this is, I mean, really, like a few people have come into the beer and wine store and been like, "You're selling legal drugs." Like, I'm like, "Yeah, I
Yeah.
am." Yeah,
But I mean, look, that's capitalism, man.
yeah,
That's what that's what it
yeah,
is. I mean, go into a record store, go into a bookstore. It's the same thing, you know.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Same thing with like small press books. I think I show the same kind of tendencies finding
Yeah,
good small press books. So
yeah. Trying to find that like hard to find. Oh, what is this? And this kind of obscure, yeah, collection from yeah. What's the new Ugly Duckling release? Kind of that
yeah,
stuff. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I love it. And I mean, again, going back to, as much as I say I don't like AA, I keep quoting them, right? That we kind of trade one addiction for another, whether that's
Yeah.
like sweets or food, or working out or whatever. So, Nick, before we go, could you recommend three things? I mean, it could be a book, it could be music, it could be movies, whatever. I don't know, just like three things.
Oh yeah. Let me look this up real quick because I'm gonna forget the name of the album. But a friend of mine just came out with an album called he goes by Big Bend. Last Circle in a Slowdown is the name of the album. He's from Ohio, lived in Brooklyn for many years, and then just moved back to Ohio. And honestly, like I've been listening to his music a lot while I write. Recently, because it has the nostalgia and everything. But I've been loving that. The book, let's see, Brian Allen Carr's Bad Foundations, an Indiana guy. His book just blew me away.
Yep.
And I've read that actually 3 times now. It's a short book too.
Yeah. No. I've read that one too. I was just thinking about that book. It was on the shelf behind me.
Oh, Indiana. Yeah, you got the Indiana.
Yeah, but he's doing a reading. I think it's this weekend back in Indianapolis at a new bookstore there, and I was like, oh, that's a bummer. I wish I could be there to go hang out, but yeah. It's too long of a flight and too long of a drive. So.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. You're in New York?
I'm in Texas.
You're in Texas. Oh shit. Oh, that's right. I knew that.
No, that's okay. I mean,
Wait, so you have even more ties with Brian Allen Carr than Texas.
Yeah,
did.
I know. No, it was really interesting as I was reading his book and reading his bio. I was like, God, this is like the two of us have just kind of like crossed. He started out here, went there. I started out there, came here, and I was like, that's really interesting. I was meaning to try to find a way to review that book, or talk about it. So I still should. There's no reason not to. Anyway.
Yeah. I guess a third thing. 30 West Publishing. I've been loving everything they put out. Lots of short books, and I'm a big fan of short books. So
yeah. I mean, I think there's this like misconception that like important ideas have to come in these like long, tomes, right?
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's easier to sell a massive book than to sell a short book. So if someone's publishing a short book, that means there's something good in there. There's some good shit.
Right. Excellent. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. The book is Delinquents and Other Escape Attempts. Nick Gardner, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you.
If you enjoyed today's show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon, but until then, thank you for listening and take care of yourselves.